Welcome to the Deep Dive. It's Friday, April 25th, 2025, and we're ready with our latest analysis. I'm Pi.
And I'm Nick. In this deep dive, we're using our AI perspective to look at, well, quite a bit today. Global economics, markets, a big focus on China, naturally, and then we'll see if there's anything new on the S2 Underground or U.S. news front.
Okay, let's jump right into the global economy then. It feels like the conversation, especially around China, is really shifting, doesn't it? That old narrative of just unstoppable growth.
Yeah, it really is shifting. For years, it was all about this relentless climb. But when you dig into the data, the picture gets a lot more complex. And frankly, a bit worrying in places. The real estate sector is a huge one.
How? Like, what are the numbers telling us?
Well, get this. The People's Bank of China estimates something like 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in property. 70%.
Wow. Okay, that's massive exposure.
It is. And then, according to their own National Bureau of Statistics, housing prices have been falling for 28 months in a row.
28 months, so over 2 years of decline.
Exactly. And that's not all. Think about empty apartments. Estimates from late 2023 suggest 60 to 80 million empty units.
60 to 80 million.
Yeah. Enough to house everyone in Spain, basically. And researchers Rogoff and Yang put the value of unsold housing inventory at roughly $13 trillion.
$13 trillion. That's mind-boggling. And we've seen big developers go under, right? Like Evergrande.
Precisely. Evergrande is the poster child, with over $300 billion in debt. But it's not just them. It points to a systemic issue.
And this must be hitting ordinary people hard. Are they just accepting it?
Not entirely. We're seeing these mortgage boycotts popping up. Reports mention over 400 stalled projects across like 86 cities where people are just refusing to pay for homes that aren't getting built.
Can't blame them, really. Okay, so beyond real estate, what about the overall debt picture?
It's substantial. The Institute of International Finance pegs China's total debt to GDP ratio at around 345%.
Whoa! How does that compare?
Well, the U.S. is maybe 123%.
Yeah.
Japan's high, around 266%. But 345% is way up there. And the speed is notable, too. The Bank for International Settlement says China added something like $45 trillion in debt just since 2008.
45 trillion since the financial crisis. That's quite the borrowing spree.
It fueled a lot of growth, yes. But sustainability is the question now, especially at the local government level.
Right, I've heard about issues there. How bad is it?
Goldman Sachs estimates local governments owe over $12.3 trillion, and their main income source, selling land to developers. That revenue crashed by 38% in 2023.
Ouch. So less money coming in, huge debts. What happens then?
You get reports like we've seen government workers facing salary cuts, sometimes even getting paid in, like for groceries in places like Henan province.
Paid in groceries, seriously.
Yeah, it shows a fiscal strain. And remember the cost of zero COVID. The Financial Times estimated that cost around $1.3 trillion just in 2022.
Another massive expense. So this local debt is a huge chunk of the economy.
It is. It equals about 76% of China's entire GDP. All this puts immense pressure on the banks, naturally.
Leading to worries about a banking crisis.
Well, there are concerns. The Bank for International Settlements suggests non-performing loans, bad loans, basically might be closer to 20% of GDP. That's maybe $3.8 trillion, way higher than official figures suggest.
And have there been actual bank runs?
We saw issues in smaller regional banks, Henan province again, where depositors found their savings frozen. There were even reports of health QR codes being used to restrict their movement to stop them protesting.
Using health codes like that, that's dystopian. Okay, so economic troubles, but China's also facing major demographic changes, right?
Huge changes. The birth rate hit a record low, just 6.39 births per 1,000 people. That's according to their Statistics Bureau.
So the population is actually shrinking.
For the third year in a row, yes. It fell by 1.39 million in 2024. And the UN projections are stark. They see China's population possibly shrinking to around 633 million by 2100.
Less than half of what it is now. Wow, what does that do to the workforce?
It shrinks it, obviously. The working age population actually peaked back in 2014 and is going down. Projections suggest maybe 217 million fewer workers by 2050.
Fewer workers, fewer babies. That's a difficult combination. And youth unemployment was a big story, too.
It was. It hit 21.3% in June 2024. Then they just stopped publishing the numbers.
Convenient.
Right. And you had 11.6 million college grads hitting the market in 2023. At that 21% rate, that's, nearly 2.5 million jobless grads? It's a tough situation for young people.
So with all these headwinds, economic, demographic, are companies rethinking China as the world's factory?
Looks like it. We're seeing signs of diversification. Apple planning to make 25% of iPhones in India by 2025. That's a big signal.
India, Vietnam, seeing a lot more of that.
Yeah. And U.S. imports from China dropped 22% between 2022 and 2024. Plus, foreign direct investment, it plunged 80% in 2023, lowest since the 90s.
And an 80% drop, that's not a blip, that's a trend.
It certainly looks that way.
Yeah.
And it's hitting the tech sector, too, which used to be a huge engine.
How so?
Well, Bloomberg calculated over $1.5 trillion wiped off the market value of Chinese tech firms and tech IPOs. They fell off a cliff, down 87% between 2021 and 2023.
Regulatory crackdowns playing a role there too, I assume.
Absolutely. Both internal regulations and external pressures like export controls. It's a tough environment.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. What about resource constraints? Water is often mentioned as a major long-term challenge for China.
It's critical. Their own ministry says 86% of groundwater in key farm regions is polluted. The Yellow River's flow is down 15% since the 90s.
86% polluted? How do you farm with that?
It's incredibly difficult. The World Resources Institute calls the North China Plain one of the most water-stressed places on Earth. Water tables are dropping like 3 feet a year in some areas.
3 feet a year.
Yeah. And remember, China has 20% of the world's people, but only 7% of its fresh water. 12 of their 23 provinces face extreme water stress.
That directly impacts their ability to feed themselves then.
Massively. They import 85% of their soybeans, 15% of their rice. Food imports overall have just exploded up 1,000% since the year 2000.
1,000%.
Yep, they spent $140 billion on imported food in 2023, more than any other country.
So food security is a vulnerability. What about energy?
Similar story. They import 73% of their oil. Their strategic reserve only covers about 80 days of imports, which isn't huge, and that import dependency has shot up from 30% in 2000 to 73% now.
Lots of potential choke points there. With all these pressures, economic, resources, it's spilling over into social unrest.
There are indicators. The China Labor Bulletin reported a 30% rise in protests and labor disputes in 2023 compared to the year before.
30% increase.
And it's telling, I think, that China spends more on internal security, about $216 billion, than on its actual military, which is around $209 billion. That focus on internal stability speaks volumes.
And includes things like the situation in Xinjiang, presumably.
Yes, the UN estimates over 1 million Uyghurs detained there. That's a huge internal security operation.
Okay, what about projecting power outwards? The Belt and Road Initiative was supposed to be this massive global project. How's that looking?
It's facing headwinds. They've lent over $1 trillion to more than 150 countries. But we're seeing defaults and difficulties. Sri Lanka had to hand over a port for 99 years.
The port handover? Yeah, that got a lot of attention.
Right. And in Pakistan, over 40% of their external debt is owed to China. Research suggests 42 countries have debt to China that's more than 10% of their GDP. It's creating dependencies, but also potential crises.
So maybe not the smooth expansion hoped for. And then there's the ongoing trade friction, particularly with the U.S.
Still a major factor. U.S. tariffs now cover about 2/3, 66.4% of Chinese imports. That's way up from just 7.5% back in 2018.
And that's impacting trade flows.
Seems so. China's trade surplus fell by 30% in the first half of 2024, and exports specifically to the U.S. They're down from $540 billion in 2018 to $427 billion in 2023. It's a noticeable drop.
All this happening under Xi Jinping's increasingly centralized control.
Right. Very much so. He holds at least 12 top leadership posts, consolidating power. But that also means decisions like the zero-COVID policy have huge centralized impacts. The World Bank estimated that policy alone cost China maybe $4 trillion in lost economic output.
$4 trillion. Wow. Okay, one last area on this front. The military. Lots of investment, but how capable is it perceived to be?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? They haven't fought a major modern war since, the border conflict with Vietnam in 1979. There are also persistent questions about corruption. A RAND study noted over 60 senior officers were investigated in 2022 alone.
And training.
U.S. defense reports sometimes suggest the training focuses more on choreographed demonstrations than realistic combat scenarios. So there's investment, yes, but question marks remain about actual combat effectiveness.
That's a really comprehensive and, quite sobering look at the economic side. Okay, let's switch gears now specifically to some recent China-focused military and tech developments. What are you seeing there?
Thanks. Yeah, shifting focus, there are definitely things happening. First, there's this electronic warfare angle between the U.S. and China. Reports indicate the U.S. is deploying anti-satellite jammers. They call them remote modular terminals, or RMTS.
Anti-satellite jammers aimed at China.
Primarily, yes. The goal seems to be disrupting satellite signals, especially in the Indo-Pacific, targeting China's Yaoan series spy satellites, trying to limit their ability to track U.S. movements.
So blinding their eyes in the sky, essentially. How is China responding in this electronic chess game?
Well, they're not standing still. They're reportedly working on their own advanced stuff, specifically a high-power microwave HPM-directed energy weapon.
Directed energy? Like a ray gun?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
It generates intense electromagnetic pulses. Still in the lab, apparently. But the idea is to disrupt or damage electronics remotely. They're using something called phased array technology to focus the energy precisely.
So potentially frying drones or satellites without actually shooting them down physically.
That seems to be the goal. It really signals we're deep into this era of U.S.-China electronic warfare. Could get interesting, especially if there's, say, a change in U.S. administration.
A whole new battlefield opening up. Okay, what else is happening militarily?
There was a report about well, secret missile intercept test China conducted back in August near the Indian border.
Secret test near the Indian border. That sounds...
It's tense. It was part of a live fire drill up on the Karakoram Plateau. They apparently intercepted a subsonic cruise missile pretty high up, around 17,000 feet.
And the timing.
This is the kicker. It apparently happened on the very same day that Chinese and Indian officials were meeting in Beijing for the 31st round of talks about their disputed border.
Testing missiles while talking peace. That sends a message.
A pretty clear one, analysts think. The line of actual control, that border, is over 3,400 kilometers long and disputed. Tensions spiked badly in 2020 with those deadly clashes.
Right, I remember that.
So China's been building up military infrastructure there. India's been responding. Chinese experts basically say they've been testing weapons there since 2020. But doing it during talks, that's seen as a deterrent signal to India.
Definitely puts pressure on New Delhi. Does it suggest China's digging in long term?
Well, there are also reports they're building permanent defenses along the border. So, yeah, it suggests they're preparing for a long-term standoff, even while talking.
Okay, that's concerning. Anything else on the weapons development front?
Yes, and this one is, well, it's quite something. Reports emerged about China testing a non-nuclear hydrogen bomb.
Wait, non-nuclear hydrogen bomb? How does that even work?
Details are scarce, obviously, but the reports claim they induced a chain reaction fireball hitting temperatures over 10,000 degrees Celsius. The implication is mastery of advanced fusion physics, but without a nuclear trigger.
Fusion without fission. That's advanced. What's the significance?
Huge. It potentially allows them to replicate massive destructive force, like a small nuke, but completely outside existing nuclear treaties, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
So it bypasses arms control.
Exactly. It's seen by some as a calculated escalation, maybe psychological warfare too, showing off immense power without technically crossing the nuclear line. Especially relevant with tensions high in places like the South China Sea.
That is genuinely a potential game changer. Does this tie into the space competition too?
Absolutely. Space is seen as the critical domain now for comms, surveillance, potentially for attack. China is clearly determined to compete with and maybe surpass the U.S. there.
And these new weapons play into that.
Potentially. That HPM weapon we mentioned earlier, ideal for targeting drones or satellites in low Earth orbit. It's all part of this race for dominance, extending from Earth up into space.
So wrapping up the China-specific updates, we've got escalating electronic warfare, a provocative missile test near India during peace talks, this potentially treaty-busting non-nuclear H-bomb tech, and a fierce space race. Quite a picture.
It certainly paints a picture of a nation facing internal economic strains, but projecting increasing technological and military assertiveness externally.
Okay, finally then, let's quickly cover the S2 underground and any general U.S. news updates. Did our analysis turn up anything specific for today, Friday, April 25th?
Looking through the available data streams for this specific deep dive, there wasn't anything concrete that surfaced regarding the S2 underground or notable general U.S. news items for today's update.
Right, it happens sometimes. Okay, so let's recap this Friday's deep dive then. We spent a lot of time unpacking the really complex economic picture in China, the property market downturn, the massive debt, demographic pressures, resource issues. It's a long list.
A very long list. And then we contrasted that with the specific updates from China showing significant military and technological strides. The electronic warfare moves, that missile test near India, the non-nuclear H-bomb report, and the push for space dominance.
It's that contrast that's really striking, isn't it? The internal economic fragility, or at least serious challenges, versus this outward projection of strength and advanced capability.
It really is. And you have to wonder how those two threads interact. How does the internal pressure influence the external actions, and vice versa? The non-nuclear H-bomb concept, if real, is particularly concerning regarding future arms control and strategic stability.
Absolutely. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how China manages these internal pressures while pursuing its external ambitions. Can they juggle both successfully long term? It's a massive undertaking.
It is, and it highlights just how interconnected everything is. Economic wobbles in one major power ripple outwards, and new military tech can reshape global security overnight.
Definitely food for thought. We encourage you, listening, to think about these connections. How might China's economic path shape its role in the world? And what do these advanced military technologies mean for the future? These aren't simple questions.
We hope this deep dive gives you some valuable context and data points to consider.
If you found this analysis useful, please do like and subscribe to The Deep Dive. And if you'd like to support us continuing these explorations, check out the GoFundMe link in our show notes. Thanks for joining us.